Welcome to the 13th and final episode of Final Fantasy IX Translation Analysis, the long-running series where I discuss the most fascinating differences between the game's English translation and the original Japanese script. As you probably know, the ending of Final Fantasy IX is full of goodbyes and parting words, but not all of them made it to English. So we're gonna go over the most notable omissions and changes, and along the way we'll put to rest any lingering doubts about who's speaking in the monologue during the ending. Alright, it's been a long journey, so let's go out with a bang, shall we? Well, we had our final showdown with Kuja, so the game should be over now. Wait, who's this guy? Well, it depends on the language. In English, he's called Necron, but that name was actually invented by the localization team. In Japanese, he is only ever called that which he introduces himself as even in English, the Darkness of Eternity, Eie no Yami. That's his only name in Japanese. But that difference in name still pales in comparison to the differences in his words, since his speech to Zidane before the final battle is also significantly longer and even more brutally nihilistic in Japanese. In fact, you could go as far as to say that his speech was largely rewritten in English. So let's cover some of the highlights, shall we? In English, Necron starts his speech with, well, in part, with a direct quote from Yoda from Star Wars, which was not a thing in Japanese.
All life bears death from birth. Life fears death, but lives only to die. It starts with anxiety. Anxiety becomes fear.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
The only cure for this fear is total destruction. Kuja was a victim of his own fear. He concluded he could only save himself by destroying the origin of all things, the crystal.
Now let's take a look at the Japanese speech, going over each line along with a more faithful translation.
恐怖は生きる者がこの世に生を授かった時から、それらすべての心の中に例外なく存在している。From the moment living beings receive the gift of life in this world, without exception, fear is born in their hearts. 生きるということは残酷な行為。お互いを排除し、自らの生のために生命を奪い合う。The very act of living is inherently cruel. In order to preserve your own life, you must take the lives of others and eliminate each other. そして生きることは不安、苦悩、いつかは死ぬという恐怖を常に抱えていること。Thus, to live is to bear the constant anxiety, anguish, and fear of knowing that you will die one day. 逃れることのできない死に気づき、それに打ち勝つことができなかったとき、恐怖は目覚める。Fear awakens from the moment you realize the inescapability of death. 死への恐怖は恐れるほどに増大していき、やがて死を認めたくないという苦痛を与え、生命への像、生きる者への使徒へと変化していく。The greater your fear of death, the more you wish to deny it. Before long, the pain of this denial mutates into a hatred for life and envy towards the living. 増大した死の恐怖を止めることはできない。救うことができるのは全ての破壊しかない。You cannot stop your growing fear of death. The only means of salvation is to destroy everything.
Okay, so, assuming you're still with me after that veritable avalanche of nihilism and negativity, let me point out that only now does Necron begin to talk about Kuja in Japanese. I mean, just look at the size and content difference of his speech prior to that in each version. As you can see, I wasn't kidding or exaggerating when I said that the Japanese speech was much longer and even more nihilistic and that it had been largely rewritten in English. Anyway, after Necron starts talking about Kuja, the English translation does become more faithful to the Japanese, so we can skip that part. But to summarize for context, Necron basically says that he arrived at his answer when Kuja decided to destroy everything. The answer being, of course, that the only salvation for the fear that comes with being alive and being mortal is for life to end entirely. In both English and Japanese, Zidane tells him that they won't let him do that, not as long as they have the will to live. But then Necron makes another speech that also feels altered and abridged in English. So here it is.
Foolish creature, your fears have already deluded you. One day, you will choose destruction over existence as Kuja did. When he sought to destroy the crystal, the purpose of life ended. Now, come, enter the zero world that you desire.
Now let's take a look at the Japanese.
苦しみながらも生きていこうとするのは、生きる希望という不治の病に侵されている証。The very fact that you cling to a life of suffering is proof that you've been afflicted with the incurable illness known as the will to live. そしていつかは恐怖に屈し、クジャのように破壊の道を選ぶ。つまり、すべてを破壊するために進化しているに過ぎない。And one day, you will give in to your fear, and just like Kuja, you will choose the path of destruction. In other words, your evolution can only lead to the destruction of all things. 破壊のために生まれてくるのなら、初めてから存在しなくても同じこと。すべては矛盾でしかない。Since you were born only to destroy, you might as well have never existed to begin with. Your entire existence is nothing but a contradiction. 自ら出した答えを否定する必要はない。すべては真理であり、無こそがすべて。There is no point in denying the answer you have provided yourselves. It is all true. Nothingness itself is everything. 無に帰れ、逆らうことはない。それが生きるすべてのものの願い。Return to nothing. You cannot defy this command. It is the wish of all living things.
So again, you can see how much they had to shorten and rewrite his speech in English. Now, the main reason for that is probably the usual issue that I've mentioned so many times before in this series, but since this is the last episode, it bears repeating. You can say a lot more in Japanese than in English with the same number of characters. Necron's own name is a perfect example of that. In Japanese, his name is Eien no Yami. That's just 4 characters. In English, a translation of his Japanese name, Darkness of Eternity, is 18 characters long, 20 if we count the spaces. In fact, that may very well be why they came up with the name Necron in the first place, since it's unlikely Darkness of Eternity could fit into the slot for his name as a boss. So yeah, to an extent, it was inevitable that Necron's lengthy speeches would have to be abridged in English, but some parts do feel not just abridged, but straight up rewritten and changed. So I do still wonder if perhaps the translators thought that some of the things he says in Japanese were a little too dark and nihilistic for a teen-rated game? I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking here, but yeah, can't help but wonder. Anyway, before Necron ruins the mood completely, let's move on to slightly less depressing things, shall we? When the party is about to leave the Iifa tree behind, Zidane hears Kuja's voice in his mind. In English, it tells him, "Farewell, Zidane." In Japanese, Kuja says, "Zidane,
生きるんだ。
live on, Zidane." As we all know, this prompts Zidane to decide to stay behind and go help Kuja. The party doesn't react well to that, and Eiko in particular says the following in English. "Come on, Zidane, why are you doing this?" In Japanese, she outright says that it's okay to leave a guy like Kuja behind. And honestly, I like that someone shares this perspective, since Kuja did commit some serious atrocities, so it makes sense that there would be at least one person who would explicitly say that he's not worth it. In both English and Japanese, Zidane explains that he might have done the same thing as Kuja if he had been in his shoes. In English, he concludes with, "I know it sounds crazy, but I know deep down inside I have to do this." These lines are completely different in Japanese. As usual, the English localization didn't like having Zidane waxing philosophical. Here's what he says in Japanese. 助けられるかもしれない命をこのまま放っておいていいって言うのか? 誰だっていつかは死ぬとはいえ、自分から死を選ぶ必要はないだろ? We could translate this as, "It's a life that can be saved. How can I just leave it behind?" Just because everyone's going to die someday doesn't mean we should choose death over life. With that, the party finally accepts Zidane's decision and they all say some parting words to him. In English, Eiko says, "Zidane, I love you, you'd better come back." In Japanese, there's no such confession, which I think makes sense because by this point, Eiko had already resigned herself to the fact that there's only room for Garnet in Zidane's heart. She even told Mikoto as much back in Branbal. So in Japanese, she just says, "Zidane, 絶対死んじゃダメよ。Eikoが絶対に許さないからね。Zidane, you better not die. I'll never forgive you if you do." As for Zidane and Garnet's own farewell, in Japanese they both adopt the same formal tone as when they first met, and she asked to be kidnapped, and he solemnly swore to fulfill her requests. As usual, this kind of stuff is hard to transpose into English, so the translators simply had Zidane refer to Garnet as Your Highness and called it a day. But in Japanese, the formality is much more pronounced throughout the entire exchange, and it does paint the scene in a slightly different light, as you get the feeling that they're hiding behind this veneer of formal language because if they spoke normally as themselves, they wouldn't be able to bear parting with each other. When Zidane finds the dying Kuja within the Iifa tree, the two genomes have the following exchange in English. "What are you doing here? I thought I told you to go." Wouldn't you do the same for me if you knew I was dying? Never mind. Now, I believe I said that what the translation did to Beatrix was probably the biggest issue in the entire English script, and I probably still stand by that, but what the translators did here actually bugs me more. Because in Beatrix's case, the changes can be potentially chalked up to mere oversights and slip-ups during the laborious process of translation. But what the translators did in this scene was definitely 100% deliberate, because Zidane's English response to Kuja's question of "Why did you come?" in no way, shape or form resembles what he actually said in the original script, where his reply was none other than "Dareka o tasukeru no ni ryu ga iru kai?" Do I need a reason to help someone? Or, in other words, you don't need a reason to help people. Yes, it's the famous quote from his title card. He actually says it in-game, in the climatic ending scene between him and his dying brother no less. And yet the translator decided to do away with it and turn it into a joke instead, in a scene that was meant to be serious, sad, and poignant. Just why? Well, just like you don't need a reason to help people, I guess you don't need a reason to mistranslate either. Man, I still remember playing the original Dissidia for the PSP and hearing Zidane actually say that line in the story and thinking, wow, he actually said it here. Awesome. He never really said it in Final Fantasy IX story. Well, turns out he did, but the English translators decided to censor him. I'm sorry, I try not to insert my own feelings too much into these videos, but this change in particular does bother me a lot. I mean, they even turned Zidane's solemn silence before his dying brother into a punchline for their untimely joke. Never mind. Now, of course, this is just my opinion and you're free to enjoy and even prefer the English exchange. But just to make my position clear, let me reiterate that I'll give Final Fantasy IX's English translation all the credit in the world. It's a great translation overall. I couldn't do a better job. What I've done in this series is more akin to post-editing, which is a much easier job, where you simply iron out the remaining kinks after someone's already done all the hard work. But still, turning a moment and a line like that into a literal joke is, in my opinion, not only a poor translation, but it also feels a little disrespectful towards the source material, and that's disappointing. But that's just me. Let me know how you feel about that change down in the comments. Maybe it doesn't bother you as much or at all, in which case I say,
Good for you!
Anyway, moving on. Despite Zidane's best efforts, Kuja doesn't make it, and as a result, we get a beautiful eulogy for him by none other than Mikoto. Here's how it goes in English. Kuja, what you did was wrong, but you gave us all one thing: hope. We were all created for the wrong reason, but you alone defied our fate. We do not want to forget this. we want your memory to live on forever, to remind us that we were not created for the wrong reason, that our life has meaning. This is a good translation. It sounds beautiful and poetic, which was especially important here, but there is one line in English that, in my opinion, doesn't make that much sense, which is to remind us that we were not created for the wrong reason. Because, well, they kinda were. That's the point. They were created for the awful reason to serve as empty puppet vessels for the souls of the people of Terra after Gaia was assimilated and the people of Gaia were exterminated by Garland's Angels of Death. In Japanese, Mikoto never denies that the reason for their creation was wrong. What she says is, 私たちは信じたいの。私たちがこのように生を受けたことは決して間違いじゃなかった。Now, I can understand the translators having had to get creative with this line because it's not easy to translate it into English in a way that preserves its meaning and beauty while sounding natural. My best attempt would be, we want to believe that it was not a mistake for us to come into this world. See, that's different from saying that the reason for their creation wasn't wrong. What she's suggesting is that their birth and their existence itself aren't inherently wrong or bad, even though the intentions of their creator were. The problem of saying that they weren't created for the wrong reason is that the whole inspiring aspect of Kuja's character is that he was created for the wrong reasons, but he defied those reasons and showed that it was possible for the genomes to create their own purpose for living and to give their lives their own meaning, rather than following Garland's twisted plans for them. So yeah, it's not a big deal, and Mikoto's English speech is still beautiful and very powerful and touching, but I just thought I'd mention that, because it always struck me as weird that she starts the speech by saying, we were all created for the wrong reason, but then goes on to say, we were not created for the wrong reason. That confusion or contradiction isn't really present in Japanese. So, as you all know, Final Fantasy IX's Epilogue is interspersed with a touching blacked out monologue, and in the years following the game's release, there was a lot of discussion and speculation as to whom was speaking in this monologue. The transcription of the English script by Shotgun Nova on GameFAQs, which helped me out a lot while making these videos, even comments on this, saying, some seem to think that it's pure Vivi narrative. Some think that it's Vivi narrative with Mikoto in it. Personally, I believe that it's each character who's played a role giving a summary of what they learned from Zidane. Now, this was written in 2006, so they don't necessarily feel the same way nowadays, and I do believe that the fandom as a whole has mostly accepted that the entire monologue belongs to Vivi, and if you haven't yet, I'm here to tell you, you should, because in Japanese, there isn't a shadow of a doubt that it's Vivi speaking the whole time. If you've been following this series from the start, you'll know that each party member has a very distinctive way of speaking in Japanese, as well as a unique first-person pronoun that they use to refer to themselves. Well, they're not all unique. Zidane and Salamander share the rough masculine pronoun of ore. Freya and Quina both use the more neutral watashi, but only Garnet uses the more formal version of that, watashi, while Steiner uses jibun, and Eiko uses her own name, speaking in the third person. And then there's Vivi, who is the only party member to use the pronoun of boku. Well, guess which pronoun the entire ending monologue uses? That's right, it's boku, Vivi's pronoun of choice. The only other notable character in the game to use boku is Kuja, but we also know it's not him because of the way boku is written here. See, when Kuja uses boku, it's written in kanji because he's very eloquent and sophisticated, but when Vivi says it, it's written in katakana because he's a small child with a simple vocabulary, and in the ending monologue, boku is written in katakana, not kanji. So again, the evidence is pretty clear. The whole monologue consists of Vivi's parting words to Zidane and all his friends. Speaking of Vivi and first-person pronouns, it's interesting to note that Vivi's son, the one that speaks to Puck in the ending, actually uses the pronoun of ore written in katakana just like when Zidane says it. So this could be an indication that at least one of Vivi's children grew to have a more assertive personality like Zidane, which is pretty cool to think about. As for the translation of the monologue itself, it's pretty faithful for the most part, so there's no point covering the whole thing. But there is one section that's different enough in Japanese. It's after the Beatrix scene where Vivi says in English, "Even if you say goodbye, you'll always be in our hearts, so I know we're not alone anymore." Funnily enough, the opening line here was actually one of Vivi's custom quotes in the Cydia opera Omnia, so I can even use that recording.
別れることは決して悲しいことじゃないよね。
That was Ikue Otani, Vivi's Japanese voice actress, who also voices Pikachu in Pokemon and Chopper in One Piece. She's pretty adept at voicing tiny cute characters, isn't she? Anyway, now watch as I butcher her Vivi voice. 離れていても心が通じ合ったよね。そんな大切なことを教えてくれたんだよね。Saying goodbye doesn't have to be a sad thing, right? Because our hearts remain connected even if we're apart. You taught me that precious lesson. So yeah, bit of a difference there, but that's basically it. The English speech is quite faithful otherwise. As for the brief scenes showing each party member, the ones that stand out the most in Japanese are Freya's and Garnet's. Here's Freya and Fratley's exchange in English. How long will it take to rebuild Bermesia? I don't care, as long as I am with you. I love you, Freya. Yet he still doesn't remember our past. I just want to cherish our time right now. It's funny that this is the second time that the English translation inserts the words "I love you" into a scene that didn't have them in the original script. I'm starting to notice a trend because this goes on to happen yet again in the ending of the very next Final Fantasy. But yeah, in Japanese, when Freya tells Fratley that she doesn't care as long as he's with her, he simply replies that he feels the same way. Furthermore, Freya doesn't think to herself in the following line in Japanese. Instead, she says, out loud from the start, フラットレ様、生きていてくれてよかった。思い出など、また作り直せばいい。Which can be translated as, Sir Fratley, I'm so glad you were alive. Don't worry about your memories. We can always make new ones. And then there's Garnet's scene. In English, she says she's looking forward to seeing everyone again, but then adds, But it'll never be the same. I have to let go of the past. I have to move on, just like he taught me. In Japanese, we learn in more detail how hard she's been taking Zidane's absence. でも、もうあの日々は二度と帰ってこないのね。だから、もう泣いてばかりはいられない。涙は雪に変えて。But those days will never come back. So I have to stop crying all the time and change tears into courage. Damn, that's harsh. You better have had a very good reason for not showing up earlier, Zidane. And thus, we reach the final scene. Even though it's an FMV, we still get a last exchange between Zidane and Garnet, which is a bit tricky to translate, but thankfully they did a great job with it. How did you survive? I didn't have a choice. I had to live. I wanted to come home to you. Here in Japanese, Zidane once again uses the recurring expression "itsuka kaeru tokoro," which was earlier translated as "a place to call home." As I mentioned in episode 9, a more literal translation would be "a place to return to someday" or "a place to go home to someday." But it would be hard to include that reference in English, since you could easily end up with an awkward line like "I had to live, to return to the place to call home." And therefore, "I wanted to come home to you" was a good compromise. Likewise, the very last lines were translated in a very sensible manner as well, so that they sound perfectly natural in English. In Japanese, Zidane says, だから歌ったんだ、あの歌を. This sounds beautiful in Japanese, but literally translated it would be, so I sang it, that song. Not so beautiful, right? Which is why the translators went with, so I sang your song, our song. Perfect. And a perfect conclusion to an overall stellar translation. Well, this series is now officially over. But, as Vivi said in Japanese, saying goodbye doesn't have to be a sad thing. You know, as they say, don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened. As Final Fantasy IX fans, we should all know that lesson by now. Now, in case you're curious about the future of this channel now that this series is over, when I first started this channel almost a year ago, my main goal was to do this translation analysis series for Final Fantasy IX, and then, once I finished it, I would see what the channel looked like in terms of growth and whatnot, and then think about what I felt like doing moving forward. I'll be transparent and admit that I was hoping this series would have attracted more viewers, so it was a bit demoralizing at times, but I managed to pull through and complete it in the end, largely thanks to you guys that gave me a chance, and to your comments about how much you were enjoying these videos and how much you looked forward to new episodes. I mean it, that really helped me keep it going, so thank you for the support, thank you for sticking with this series to the end, and I hope you'll continue to follow and support the channel, even though I may not upload new videos as often in the near future since 1. I'm a bit burned out after finishing such a long and laborious series, and 2. I'm a bit busier in real life right now than when I started the channel. But I do still hope to create more content and make new videos every now and then, so hopefully you'll be along for the ride. Now, just so you know, I probably won't be doing another full translation series because, again, that takes a lot of work, but I could still do standalone videos on the translations of other Final Fantasies one day. We'll see. But either way, those aren't the only kinds of videos I'm interested in doing. I have plenty of ideas for other videos, and I may also diversify my range of topics beyond the Final Fantasy series into other games and even other mediums like anime and TV shows. So hopefully you'll give those a chance too if you're into that stuff. But if you're only interested in Final Fantasy content, then please don't go anywhere, because as long as I keep making videos, I'll definitely want to talk about Final Fantasy every once in a while. Especially if we get some hype news like, you know, a goddamn confirmation of the Final Fantasy IX remake already. Anyway, I've dragged this on for too long. If you're still listening after all that, I appreciate it, and whenever my next video drops, I hope to see you again, Chocobros. Peace.